On Monday, I had a tour of the Parksville watershed from Trevor Wicks, and I witnessed what's been happening in this community. And as we were looking at the very strangled Romney Creek, it was amazing. It was perfect timing. We were looking at the creek, and then this BC Water Service truck drove by and pulled into someone's driveway, and I was like, oh, what's that about? And the people in the car looked at me and they're like, well, they're filling up someone's well, obviously, because people's wells have ran dry. So right there, it was just kind of case in point, this serious disconnect between what is happening and the effects. This is a local problem that is beginning to appear all over this planet. In the past 2 weeks, I've noticed, perhaps you have as well, two issues in the media that have been alongside the usual suspects, and they are climate change and water issues. And I was just in Alberta a couple weeks ago, and in Alberta they had a week-long CBC series on their local water. This is a huge issue in a province that is totally basking in the wealth of a serious resource, which is oil. But here they're really worried about an even more important resource, which is water. Now, climate change and water, these two are absolutely connected. They are absolutely interdependent, and they affect each other in ways that we haven't really begun to understand. And on Monday, it was explained to me, Mr. Wick's theories about how the depletion of our water tables and rivers has transformed the local hydrology system, how less water for the trees affects their ability to transpire, which produces clouds, which produces rain. And so you see how the whole system begins to get messed up, and you get a localized climate change, which perpetuates the problem. And you can imagine how, if you have little pockets of this happening all over the world, this is a huge contributor to our global climate change. And this really isn't being highlighted in the media. You always hear about emissions and, air pollution. But what about what is happening to our water systems? Water is a huge issue that has only begun to hit the international consciousness. It's been compared to oil. They say water is the next oil. But I think that there is a fundamental difference between the two. If people don't have oil, they get mad. They might start a war. But if people don't have water, clean water, they can't survive. The fact that here on a rainforest coast in a developed country are experiencing serious drought, serious water issues is a pretty dire indication of the condition of water around the planet. For me, the water issues that I saw on Monday, and that you've probably been getting tours on this weekend, are a perfect example of the fundamental disconnect that Kim was talking about a little bit. This fundamental disconnect that our society has with the natural world that absolutely sustains our every breath, our every day of life. And here in this area, I realize what's happened is a classic example of the famous tragedy of the commons, and how our disconnect has led to things that just don't make sense. We have to start putting the world back together again. Now, I'm 26 years old. I've been working on what they call environmental issues since I was about 9 years old, which is starting to be quite a long time now. And I want to talk first of all about this very word, the environment. Now just take a minute and think about the average person you know, someone who isn't very necessarily aware or interested in issues of water or environment, and imagine they're just doing their thing. Maybe they're stuck in traffic somewhere, or, in their car, or they've been at school or work, just going about their normal day, and they hear on the radio this word, the environment. And without thinking very hard, what are some things you think that they automatically think of when they hear this word, the environment? Just raise your hand. Yep. Tree hugger. Tree hugger, perfect.
A threat.
A threat.
Yes.
A threat, interesting.
I find people react negatively and think that it's a threat to their lifestyle that they want to lead.
Good one, a threat to our lifestyles.
Job losses.
Job losses. Back there.
That's where we spend 90% of our time is inside, so their environment has nothing to do with the natural environment.
Interesting. Well, that's a more aware concept of the environment than I think a lot of people have, though. Any others? Environment?
Flaky.
Flaky. Yeah?
Something that's disconnected from you is something out there somewhere else.
Well, exactly, and that's the kind of point that I wanted to come to. I think that when most people think about, just in passing, this idea of the environment, they think of something out there. They might think of the Amazon rainforest, or they might think of tree huggers. They might think of crazy old David Suzuki. They might think of the Kyoto Protocol, or something that is connected to this concept of environment that does not affect people in their everyday lives. We don't think of it as everything that surrounds us. Most people don't think of it as the mall, even though that's where they are hanging out in. That is our environment. We don't think of it as the food that we eat. We don't think of it as the water that we drink. We don't think of it as the air that we all are breathing right now and sharing. We don't think of it as our jobs, our economics, our communities. We don't think of it as our waste. The environment is simply where we exist, and we are absolutely a product of the environment that we choose to put ourselves in. We are all human animals in this room, like it or not. We are acutely dependent and affected by all these things, and so we have to be absolutely concerned about our environment. And I bring this up because of what Kim was talking about, and because I'm realizing the more I'm getting into my graduate studies in Indigenous ecology, in ethnoecology, which is learning about the traditional ways of looking at our natural resources, that our very concept of the environment, or even nature, is in fact the biggest difference between our Western scientific or current social view of the natural world and Indigenous views of the world. Because in Indigenous societies and traditional societies, there is no separation between ourselves and our environment. In many cultures, there's not even a word for nature or biology, because there's, we're part of that. And I think that the fact that our environment, this idea of environment, is separate from the aspects of our daily lives, I think that this is a major cultural gap that allows us to ignore those fundamental, those very basic, those absolutely obvious connections between ourselves and our actions and the things that keep us alive. And it allows us to abuse it. And it lets us get out of our responsibility to everything and everyone around us. So this is a very, very simple concept, but I believe it's absolutely fundamental. So right off the bat, I think that a big part of our task is to shift our society's very concept of what is an environmental issue, of these environmental problems, and reframe them as they are in the reality, which is these are social issues of health, economics, efficiency, culture, and fundamentally quality of life. Sustainability has to be a standard across the board in all of these things, not just relegated to this Department of Environment. Today I'm going to talk to you about my favorite topic, which is myself. No, it's what I know best. And I have to do that because I want you to know where I'm coming from and why I believe what I believe. I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to show you some slides from an adventure that I had when I was small. And actually, this story is in the Brazilian Amazon rainforest. And then afterwards, I want to talk a little bit more about why we have to become activists about the things that we care about. Now, I know that we believe what we believe because of what we learned growing up. Like all of you, I'm a product of my childhood. I grew up in Vancouver, not too far from here, and I spent a lot of my childhood down at the intertidal zone at low tide, and I definitely know that this is why I pursued a university degree in biology later on. Now, when I was about 8 years old, my little sister was 5, my parents became involved in an issue that was going on very far away in the Amazon. My dad had been doing some work in Brazil, and he had met this amazing guy called Payakan. And Payakan is a Kayapo leader, an indigenous person from southern Pará, which is a state in the Amazon. And he was working to galvanize support against the government, who he had discovered were making plans to build a series of hydroelectric dams that would flood out not only thousands of hectares of rainforest, but dozens of indigenous villages. And many of these villages, many of these tribes had no idea that these plans were being made for their territory. And so Payakan, he's an amazing person. He was, just a person living in the forest, and he traveled out into the outside world, taught himself Portuguese, taught himself how to read, and learned about these plans for that the government had. And so now that he knew, he was trying to organize a big meeting of all these different tribes to come together and protest the building of these dams. So I remember my parents got quite involved in this. Payakan eventually achieved this. He had a big meeting. Hundreds of different nations came together, and this was a big deal in itself because many of these tribes were traditionally warring tribes, and yet here they were coming together in the face of this bigger challenge. And in the end, the coalition of indigenous people won. The World Bank actually withdrew its funding, and the dams were never built. Amazing success. So this was amazing and almost impossible that it happened. And after this success, Payakan began receiving death threats. And you might remember the rubber tapper. He was quite a leader in the Brazilian environmental movement at the time. He had just been murdered. So when you get death threats in Brazil, you got to take it pretty seriously. And Payakan knew that he had to leave the country. He had to take his family with him. He had 3 little children and a wife. And he decided, okay, I'm going to leave the country. I'm going to let everything cool down for a little while. Where am I going to go? Well, he knew one family that lived in Canada, one family that lived in Vancouver, and that family was my family. And so the next thing I knew, my parents had been off doing all this cool, exciting stuff. I had to go to school. It was really unfortunate. But the next thing I know, this family from the lower Amazon, this Kayapo family, were coming to live with us in the city of Vancouver. It was crazy. They stayed with us for 6 weeks. They lived in our basement. I remember the first day that they arrived, my mom went downstairs to check on them, and she found, and Tanya, who are the 2 little girls. They're about 4 and 5 years old, and they'd made a fire in the fireplace, but then they'd pulled the coals out onto the hardwood floor. They were just playing with the fire, because where they come from, they have mud floors, so it doesn't really matter. They had these amazing punk hairdos, because in the Kayapo, if you're a female or a child, you shave your head right down the middle, kind of a reverse mohawk. So when it grows in, it's like these awesome punk hairdos. And it was great. We ended up becoming great friends with them, and my little sister, who was in kindergarten at the time, ended up taking them to school with her for show and tell. They had never seen whales before. They'd never seen the ocean before. They'd never seen snow before. They loved the whales at the aquarium. We had to go back about 13 times. And we had an amazing experience. My parents set up meetings of cultural exchange between the CUPE chief and his counterparts here in BC. And it was incredible in the smokehouses, in the longhouses of BC, to see that even though this CUPE family were from so far away, they had such a fundamental connection and awareness of what was happening to the environment around them. After 6 weeks, they had to leave. We'd had an incredible time. We were very sad to see them go. And as they were leaving, Payakan turned to us and he said, well, you've hosted us in your home, and we would like to now invite you to come and stay with us in our home in the village of Aokri. This was definitely not a light invitation, and it was the opportunity of a lifetime. And so the next summer, my mom, my dad, my sister, and I traveled down to Brazil, traveled down to the state of Pará, traveled down to the Xingu Valley of the lower Amazon, and finally traveled down into the tiny village of Aokri. Now, sometimes when you're looking back, you can really see moments or events that really made a big shift in your life. And this trip when I was 9 definitely spurred my involvement in social justice and environmental issues in a major way. And so I'd like to now share with you these slides of that adventure. So hopefully you can see. Oh, that's okay. So here we are. We're quite far away from Vancouver Island right now. We're in southern Pará. This is the Amazon rainforest. This is at the top of a serra or hill. You can see, even from this vantage point, all you can see is forest. The Amazon rainforest is absolutely massive. You can see there's a water highway right in the middle. This is the main mode of transportation, which is the Riozinho, this little river. Okay, next. This is the village of Aokri. This is Payakan's village. There's 2 ways of getting into this community of about 200-300 people. You can fly in on the left. You can see there's a tiny little runway cut into the trees on the left. You can come in that way. It takes about 45 minutes from the nearest town, flying over pretty much nothing but forest. Or you can come in on the right, on the river, and it takes about 8 days paddling from the nearest civilization. Okay, next. So we took the first option. We flew in, and this was our welcoming committee when we arrived off the airstrip. You can see my little sister. She's wearing a white hat in the upper left-hand corner. I think she's wondering, what the heck have I got myself into? When we, pretty shortly after we arrived, a few days after we arrived, there was a women's festa, a women's festival happening, and the women would gather every day, and every day was more and more elaborate, and the length of the dancing was longer and longer each day. This is the second day. You can see the regalia is starting to get pretty elaborate. Oh, here's a good slide of that hairdo I was telling you about. So, ladies, if you lived in the Amazon, you would be bald down the center of your heads. Just think about that. Next. This is the 3rd day of the festival, and you can see the women are wearing these incredible feather headdresses that their husbands weave for them. In the background, you can see the traditional houses. All of the houses look like this. They're made out of mud. The walls are made out of mud, which turns into like a concrete, and the roofs are made out of palm fronds, and they're great they're wonderfully designed for the climate that they live in. They're very nice and cool in this very hot environment. Okay, next. Here again, you can see these fabulous headdresses that they're wearing. The woman in the middle, you can kind of see her face and her huge shell earrings. That's Irakra. She's Payakan's wife. And it was pretty amazing to see her in her true context. She looked extremely different from how she did when she visited us in Vancouver. Okay, next. In the Amazon, life completely revolves around the river. It's quite a small river by Canadian standards, but it's absolutely the source of most of the protein that people eat on a day-to-day basis. And it's unbelievable the diversity of life that resides in this river and the diversity of ways that people know how to fish and hunt in the Riozinho. You can see this is one of the methods of fishing. He's throwing a net to catch a school of fish that I guess he's seen in the rapids there. Next. This is Payakan, the leader I was telling you about. And on one of the days we were there, Payakan took us on a fishing trip, all-day fishing trip. And so as we went up the river, we stopped in this particular bend in the river, and we set these floats. So there were pieces of wood with a line and a hook on the end, and put some meat on the hooks, threw them out, continued upstream where we did all kinds of different kinds of fishing. And on our way back home, we rounded the river bend, and we could see these little floats were swimming all over the river. And so that's how we knew, okay, there's a fish on the end. I think that the biggest lesson that I learned when I was staying there was that there really is no separation between yourself and the natural world. We were definitely on the food chain living there in the Amazon. This is true for us all right now, living in towns and cities in Canada, but as was mentioned before, it's very disconnected when we go to the supermarket for all our meat and food. Here, it's pretty obvious. You have to catch what you're going to eat. Next. This is my little sister and I. We've been instructed to dig for turtle eggs in one of the riverbanks, and you walk along on your heels, and if you feel a little depression in the sand, there's probably a turtle nest underneath, and so we were instructed to dig in those depressions, and we would find a whole bunch of turtle eggs, making sure always to leave a couple in the nest. They were quite the delicacy for the kaya po, but to me they tasted like ground up chalk. Next. We found our old friends again, Oe and Tanya, and the little baby Mayal. It's my sister with some new kaya po friends. Next. This is Oe and Tanya on the right. Again, looking quite different than they did in very cold Vancouver. We didn't speak each other's language, but kids don't seem to really know need to share a formal language to be able to communicate. Although I really wish that they'd informed me to not pull my shorts up so high. I can't believe I always show that slide. We left after only 2 weeks. It was an incredible 2 weeks. So completely had a huge impression on me. I had never even known really what the Amazon jungle was, and here I had just discovered this incredible world. As we flew back out over the rainforest, this time we looked down and we saw that actually the rainforest surrounding the village, very near the village, was actually on fire. You can see here there's many fires that are happening. And this is the famous burning of the Amazon jungle. The smoke was so thick, it crept into the plain. You could stare straight at the sun. It was very scary. We were in a very small vehicle in the sky. I didn't know the economics behind it. I didn't know the reasons behind it. I didn't know anything why this was happening. But it was completely, it affected me so profoundly. I didn't know that the reason that this forest is being burned is primarily because of poverty, because poor ranchers and peasants, they have to burn forest in order to be able to have cattle lands. But the Amazon soil is so thin, and when you remove all the plants from these areas, the soil flows away in about over the span of a year. And so the next year they have to burn more forest in order to support more cattle. So it's this incredibly unsustainable way of using such an incredible resource. I didn't know any of this. I just felt that this was wrong, and I had to do something. So when I got back to Canada, I was in grade 5 at the time, and this is a couple years later, but I told my friends what I had seen about this incredible world that existed, how my CUPE friends were right at the center of this, and how it was being destroyed. They'd also heard about problems with our environment. This was during the 80s, so we'd heard a lot in the media about the ozone layer and about air pollution and water pollution. But we didn't really know very much, and so we thought, well, let's start by getting ourselves educated. And we decided to form a club. We called ourselves ECHO, the Environmental Children's Organization, and that's where we started. We just started having meetings, started talking to teachers, parents, friends of parents, anybody who knew anything about environmental problems. And we started doing little projects. We started with things like beach cleanups. We started learning about local NGOs that were doing neat advocacy work in surrounding watersheds. We started publishing a small newsletter with the help of the Environmental Youth Alliance, a newsletter for other kids with the information we were learning. And we had a great time. It was incredibly educational at the same time as being really, really fun. In about 1991, after a few years of just starting to get involved like this, I heard about a huge meeting that was going to take place in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. This was going to be a UN conference, the United Nations Earth Summit, and this was going to be the largest gathering of heads of state ever held. They were going to talk about issues of environment and development. And the whole buzz about this conference was that it was really going to set the tone for the rest of the 20th century. It was really going to be the make or break meeting to deal with our environmental health in the future. So we heard about this conference and we thought, well, there's going to be all these old men sitting around talking about our future. Who is going to remind them of why they are really there and who their decisions are actually going to really affect? Well, we should go. Yeah, great idea. ECHO should go to represent the future generations and the people who are ultimately affected. Great idea. Well, I told my parents this, and they said, "You're crazy? You guys are just little kids. I mean, there's going to be 30,000 people there. No, this is crazy." And even though well, my dad especially said this to me, we just thought that this was a really worthwhile idea to at least start to explore it. We started just talking about this idea to anybody who would give us their ear, parents, teachers, friends of parents, and lo and behold, people started donating money to our cause. Well, that kind of freaked us out because then we realized, holy cow, this might actually happen. So at that point, my mom got involved. We had an incredible amount of support from the Environmental Youth Alliance, the EYA, and they instructed us on how you hold a fundraiser, how you give speeches, how do you raise money, how do you produce event plans or agendas with little blank checks tucked inside of them to help people along. How do you make a pitch for money? All of these things. And eventually, from our community, we ended up raising enough money to send 5 of us to go to the Earth Summit. Next. So here we are in Brazil. This is ECHO, and you can see Rafi is at the center of this. He became a really big supporter of ours. He lives not too far away. He lived not too far away from us in Vancouver, and he actually ended up going down to Brazil with us as a chaperone. So we get to this conference. Now what? There were over 30,000 people there. We were 12 and 13 years old at the time, and where do you start? Well, we had registered as an NGO at the Global Forum, which was the realm where all the NGOs were put. And even though we didn't have nonprofit status or anything, I mean, we were just a kids club, but we'd registered, and it gave us a booth. So every day we would go to the booth, and all day we would just pass out these pamphlets that we'd made with a Xerox copier at home, and we had these little brooches that we made for fundraising, and most of all, we talked to people. The international media was there. There were hundreds of people from all over the world milling around. We spoke 4 different languages between the 5 of us, and so we were able to talk to a whole diversity of different people. And because we were so young, instead of this being a hindrance, this was a point of interest, and people started coming to our booth curious about why these kids were here at this very grown-up meeting. And people started inviting us to their little events that were scattered all over the conference. And we started getting our message out. We started getting very good at delivering 5-minute speeches on why we were there. And after 2 weeks of this kind of very hard work, we received a phone call from the UN. We were actually about to leave the city. We'd done our work. We'd been there for 2 weeks. We'd given a lot of little speeches. We'd never actually spoken to the world leaders. And here we were about to leave. And finally, we got a call from the UN. They said, well, if you want to get your message out to the heads of state, you have an hour. You could get down here and you could speak for 5 minutes. So we said, okay, forget about the airplane. We are going to the UN. This is why we came here. Jumped into a cab, this crazy Brazilian taxi swerving through the traffic, and we're sitting in the back seat scribbling out some kind of a speech and kind of compiling all of our messages into one speech. Got into Rio Centro, which is where the conference was being held, raced through all the security, which was absolutely insane, all these military with huge machine guns, raced up to the plenary session and up to the front, didn't have time to get nervous, thank goodness, and I was able to give a 5-minute speech. So what did I tell them? Well, I told them that I was 12. I told them that I was scared about what was happening, not only to the future, but what I was already seeing in my home in British Columbia, what I'd seen in the Amazon. And I told them that before their duties as politicians, as business people, as professionals, their first duty was as parents and as people who had to act with their children's best interests. And that was their first responsibility in these meetings, and that's what they had to think about when they made their decisions. And most people in that audience, I think, were probably even grandparents. So by the time I finished speaking, people were crying. People were standing, people were crying. Even the security guard was crying. And it was this incredible feeling because we had actually achieved this idea that we'd set out to do. And I tell this story now, it's almost separate from me 14 years later, because it shows the power of an idea and the receptiveness that people have when we talk about the fundamental, important things of life. So I think I'll stop my slides there, actually. But that's my slides from Rio. But you guys aren't off the hook yet. I have more to say. So it's been 14 years since this big, huge conference that was supposed to change the world. What has happened since? Well, it turned out that 1992, which was supposed to be this turnaround year when everybody was supposed to really dig in and make a shift in what was happening in our ecology, it turned out that this year was actually kind of the culmination of interest in the environment. And as you know, the 90s were not about sustainability. It was actually pretty much the opposite. But there's been a lot more conferences during that time. And since Rio, I've been to many conferences. I've been to many talks. I've been to Rio +5. I went to the Kyoto conference in 1997. I went to PrepComs for the Rio +10. I went to Rio +10 in Johannesburg. And the years have gone by, and it seems like the global situation hasn't gotten better, and I've gotten older, and I've slowly realized that real change does not happen at these big international conferences. Real change does not come out of these declarations. It doesn't come from those top political leaders. The only way that real change happens is from individuals, groups of individuals who decide to take responsibility for their own communities. It only happens out of gatherings like this, even smaller meetings, and I think you guys will break down later today. It takes people taking on ownership, takes people saying, well, nobody else is going to do this, so I guess we have to think of a strategy. And that's how solutions are found. On this grassroots level, amazing things are happening all over the planet. We can make all kinds of international agreements, but it's only by looking at ourselves and what we can do in our own homes that anything actually happens. And that's how we actually make a real contribution to what's happening on a global level. And that's what I hope that this weekend is all about, which is this individual agreement. Okay, let's do something about it. After 14 years of pushing for environmental reform, I'm not quite jaded, but I'm no longer prioritizing my interest in speaking to world leaders, because I don't think that's where it's going to come from. We have to be the ones to change our lives and our priorities, and I believe then our politicians will follow. So people ask, well, what can we do to become more sustainable? I spoke at the beginning of my talk about making connections to the natural world. Kim spoke about making connections to the world. And I really think that this is our starting point. We have to put ourselves back in this impression that we have of the way that the world works. Essentially, we have to reconnect back to reality. And for me, as I'm sure it is for you, our disconnect with water, how we can directly go and pollute our water source, our drinking water source. This is an extreme reflection of this incredible disconnect that we have. In understanding how we cause, how we are connected, how we affect our ecology, our world around us, that's where solutions ultimately flow from. But I could give anyone a list of, well, to be sustainable, you have to do this, this, and this, and it wouldn't make a difference. Why would that person change unless they had this fundamental understanding? And so I'm repeating it again and again, but I really think that this is our starting point. So just as an example, as an exercise for looking at how we are connected to global environmental and social issues, I'd like to share with you, and I encourage you to use these examples or find your own when you're talking to other people, of how we are revolutionizing the world with little decisions that we make in our daily lives. So I'm going to ask you 3 questions. Hands up. Who drank coffee today? Wow, that's pretty much everyone. Okay, maybe yesterday or it was Halloween this week. So in the last week, who ate chocolate? And my last question, who drank bottled water this week? Bottled water. Bottled water, bottled water. Yay, this is a water conference. Hardly anybody, that's great. Okay, so coffee, these 3 examples, we're gonna break them down. Okay, coffee. Coffee is a huge industry in itself. It's second only to oil as a global commodity. And obviously there are so many issues involved in coffee and the social issues. And I don't even want to address coffee. I just want to talk about the containers that they come in, paper cups that they come in. This has been an interest of mine for several years now, but I never actually did very much research about it. I just, brought my own travel mug. But just a couple weeks ago, I finally just broke down and went to the internet, just did a little search, and this is an unbelievable tool that we have nowadays. We have access to any information that we want. There's no excuse for not knowing things. So I found this article. It's called The Coming Catastrophe. It's from August 2003. From Portland, Oregon. And it was written by 2 baristas in Portland, which is a haven of environmentalism. These 2 baristas were serving coffee in the most environmentally sustainable building in the city. And so this building housed environmental businesses, consulting groups, some departments of government, and several NGOs. And so they were the coffee shop in this building. And they noticed that even in this tower of environmentalism, hardly anyone brought commuter mugs. And some of these people were coming in 3 times a day. And every time they were taking these tall white paper cups. So they thought, well, we must be missing something. And they started doing a little investigating. So I'm reading now. We started at the beginning. Starbucks, the world's largest purveyor of all things coffee, and a corporation that's allegedly active in waste reduction and promoting commuter mug use. A Starbucks memo read, if only 50 customers a day in every store were to use reusable mugs, Starbucks would save 1.7 pounds of paper, 3.7 million pounds of solid waste, and 150,000 trees a year. But in reality, the same memo read that in the year 2000, they found that only 1 customer per every store per day were using commuter cups, and that actually only saved 3,600 trees. So that's a far cry of the 50 cup commuter cup per day goal that they had. That number shows that every year there are hundreds of thousands of trees that are being cut down and used just for 15 minutes while we sip our lattes. And that's only for Starbucks. I went to a website called Tree Hugger. It's a great website. It's a little bit of satire in there, but it's a good information source. From this website, I found that in the year 2000, Americans used and discarded 14.4 billion disposable paper cups for hot beverages. And if you put these cups end to end, this chain of paper cups would circle the earth 55 times. Plus, the petrochemicals used for the production of these cups would be equal to keeping 8,300 homes heated for 1 year. Okay, so what about economically? It must really make sense for businesses to be buying these paper cups. Well, they did a little research and they found that a 16-ounce paper cup with cardboard sleeve and the plastic top and the stir stick and the design on the front, it costs about 22 cents to produce. So if a store does a slow day and has 200 customers in that day, which is quite slow for a successful coffee shop, they'll spend about $44 on the cups in that day, which is about the equivalent to the wages of a $7.50 an hour barista working a standard 6 to 8 hour shift. So the resources used on these disposable cups could definitely be used to pay their employees. There's also the gas to move the cups around. There's also the disposal cost, which is reflected in a $200,000 charge that the hauling company charges the local businesses. So this obviously doesn't make sense. What gives? And I'm very interested in this story because, well, another thing is that the people who are part of this coffee culture, I mean, most of us know a little bit about environmental problems. So it's funny that that this is such an issue. To me, this story points out that the disconnect is trained. We are trained to do this. And it becomes our culture. It becomes normalized. It becomes normal to do things that just do not make sense. And this shows how we can be trained to do things that eventually contribute to an ecological revolution. How we do things that can actually contribute to depletion of energy, depletion of trees, and how we do things like contribute to climate change. And if you think about it, this is a pretty new phenomenon. We've only seen the rise of coffee cups to go in the last 10, 15 years. And that's kind of shocking, but it also means that it can reverse quite easily as well. It does not always have to be like this. And the best part about it is the solution is pretty basic. I mean, just bringing your own cup, you're taking yourself out of this equation, and you don't have to contribute to this problem. So that's my rant on coffee cups. Revolution 2, chocolate. Chocolate. Now, when I found out about this one, I was pretty shocked. I definitely am someone who used to visit the vending machine around the corner in the office quite regularly. And I was a TA for a class, an introductory class in environmental studies, and we had a guest speaker, a chef, come in and do a chocolate tasting and give a lecture about the history of chocolate. Now, the history of chocolate is a fabulous story. It's a tale of royalty. It's a tale of cultural cross-pollination, of slavery, of class divisions. And I think there's just a book out there now called Bittersweet, and it's by Carol Off. It's about the history of chocolate, and I understand it's a great book. Today, it's a $13 billion industry, and most of the chocolate in the world is grown in Africa. The top, the 6 largest cocoa producers are the Ivory Coast, Ghana, Indonesia, Nigeria, Brazil, and Cameroon. And as you can imagine, these are countries where poverty is a very serious problem. Also regulation, labor regulation, very serious problem. In a study I found, 2002 study by the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, conducted on the African producers, they found that there are actually almost 300,000 children working on cocoa farms in many hazardous tasks. And of them, about 12,500 children have no relatives in the areas that they're working. And this apparently is a sure sign of child slave labor trafficking. Low wages, deregulation of agriculture, and economic crisis prevent these children and farmers from getting out of their dire poverty. So, happy Halloween. I'm not sure whose fault this is, but I don't really want to have anything to do with child labor, with child slavery. And there's a really good, clear option, and that is fair trade chocolate. Fair trade. Yeah, fair trade. You guys are a great audience. It's so great. Fair trade ensures human rights standards, and it aims to pay producers and workers a living wage. And so while we wait for fair trade to hit the big bars, and this will only happen with public lobbying, we can take ourselves out of that equation and choose the better option. And actually, since I learned about this, my love affair with chocolate has only deepened and gotten better. Okay, revolution number 3, bottled water. Now, I won't go too in-depth with this because I think that you're addressing this in this conference. And I am so glad because this is a scam that has happened right under our noses. Someone hit on the biggest scam at all, which is selling us water. It's crazy. Today, a liter of water can cost more than a liter of gas. Globally, consumers spend $35 billion a year on bottled water. Worldwide, bottled water consumption is rising at 12%. In India, it's rising at 50%. And Canada, as a country with the best water in the world and a government that is used to taking responsibility for the purity of our water, buying water from anyone else is absolutely insanity. Without even addressing the issues of waste creation, without addressing the issues of energy consumption, although I have to say that producing 1 kilogram of PET plastic needs 17.5 kilograms of water for its production. Before looking at any of these things, you have to look at the health scam that's going on. And a few weeks ago, this has been in the media quite a lot lately. A few weeks ago, I read in the Globe and Mail that the Sierra Legal Defense Fund just came out with a report that found that actually there's hardly any regulation for the cleanliness of bottled water. It's actually a completely unregulated industry. And I quote, "Regulations are in fact inadequate to ensure purity or safety." As is evident in the history of bottled water recalls and scandals of bottled water companies, it's clear you can't trust the water in the bottles. At least tap water is regulated. So that's the water actually inside the bottles. What about the bottles themselves? What about the plastic? In the States, the Natural Resources Defense Council found that a fifth of the bottles in the US contain the chemicals toluene, xylene, or styrene, which are carcinogens and neurotoxins. And when you drink anything out of a plastic bottle, you are needlessly exposing yourself to something called bisphenol A, which is a female hormone mimic. Great. But maybe, even before even looking at these issues, maybe the first conversation we need to be having is clean water a human right or not? This is apparently a good question. Worldwide, over 400 million people don't have access to clean water. Accepting to pay for water means we're kind of abandoning those people because we're saying, yeah, okay, you know, we'll pay for it. And we give up on fighting for it as a fundamental human right. So these are 3 examples of how we are absolutely revolutionizing the world with these tiny little decisions we don't even think about every day. Coffee cups, an example of a subconscious culture of waste. Chocolate, a luxury item that directly connects us to human rights abuses. And water, which is a commodification of a human right that has occurred right under our noses. Small decisions, they have huge consequences. And this really sucks because we never agreed to these things. We never agreed to be part of these social ills. It's not really our fault. So a big question is, does our ignorance relieve us of responsibility? Well, you know, maybe. If you don't know what you're doing, then how are you supposed to do anything different? But a revolutionary question to ask is, once we do know the consequences of our actions, are we not complicit? How are we doing for time now?
Well, it's gone. But
it's gone? Okay. Well, I'm gonna quickly cut to the end because there's too much to say about this. For us here on the Rain Coast, there's a pretty clear task. We have to fight for our water. And here in Canada, we're not used to fighting for our basic rights. At least mainstream Canada is not used to fighting for our basic human rights. The lack of regulation, the lack of the presence of contamination that I just saw a little bit that was happening here in this part of the world is something that I might expect to see in the third world, in a third world country, and yet here it is happening right here on Vancouver Island. And this is kind of funny because probably a lot of you moved here because you were looking to be closer to nature. Maybe you were looking for clean air and clean water. Here in Canada, we're not used to fighting for these rights. We don't know how. We don't know what to do when the government breaks its own rules. We don't know how to make the government fight for us in the face of large companies and corporations. And it is very scary. But this is how you learn. We only learn when we're forced to become activists, when it actually starts directly affecting ourselves. And there's so many precedents of what is happening right here in this community. There are so many communities who have been far less educated, far less able, who have been able to rally and organize and draw attention to their neighborhoods. And we have to join them in their fight for their communities. We have to raise all hell about what is happening to our fundamental basic rights, not only ours, but the basic human rights for our children and our children's children. And I want to just end by remembering a metaphor that I actually saw in action this summer. This summer, there was a drought on Quadra, our well was getting pretty dry, and we had a leaky tap. And so before we eventually, very quickly, changed the tap, turned off the tap, we put a bucket under the faucet, and every few seconds a drop would hit the bucket. And it was amazing because it was only once every few seconds, and it seemed every time I turned around in the kitchen, the bucket was full. And so then I put a new bucket there, and it was amazing. This bucket filled up several times before we finally dealt with the problem. And I realized, because I'd heard this expression, oh, it's just a drop in the bucket. And I realized I had a completely backwards understanding of what that metaphor was about. I thought that a drop in the bucket meant, it's not very much, it won't even matter. And yet, a drop in the bucket adds up pretty darn quickly. And pretty quick, you see your bucket is overflowing. And I realize it's kind of connected to that relinquishing of responsibility that we have with the coffee cups. You know, you might think, oh, it's just one coffee cup. Well, that one coffee cup ends up contributing to 14.4 billion coffee cups that are used every year. And so in accepting responsibility, yeah, it kind of is a pain. We got to take responsibility for our actions. But at the same time, that is incredibly empowering. We are each a drop in the bucket. And considering this is a pretty much full room, I'd say this bucket is pretty full. So there are people here who know what to do. After this weekend, you will have many ideas for next steps to take. I think you'll be pretty empowered. And just by being here, by being present in this room, you're already part of the solution. It's a pretty big challenge. You definitely have your work cut out for you. But in the end, I think we all can agree the future of our water is definitely worth fighting for. So thank you very much.